Today we're going to talk about how to do research about psychopathology. We'll do a quick overview. So first, we're going to be we are starting with a number of hypotheses, which often might look like one of these. What problems cause distress or impair our functioning? Why do people behave as they do? What can we do to help them? Who's at greatest risk and why? So one thing that we might do is a case study. And we talked about the Janine quadruplets earlier in the semester. We're going to look at them very carefully. And in fact, NIMH and Rosenhan studied them for a fairly long period of time, answering a variety of different kinds of problems or questions. The problem with case studies, however, is that there are a lot of confounds. So, for example, while it's pretty clear that there is both a genetic basis for schizophrenia and also an environmental basis, it also seems like some of the things that were going on might, in the family might have led to their current functioning. So good source of hypotheses doesn't really answer all the questions. I had been planning on talking about epidemiology, which is a kind of naturalistic observation, using one of the figures from last week. In class or on the discussion board, however, someone was talking about Andrea Yates, maybe Gina, and so I looked here for, to help us answer that question. In the general population, about 10-12% of people who are pregnant run into problems with postpartum depression. More than double that if you have a history of major depression, and almost 4 times as frequent if we're looking at a history of postpartum depression. Now, what we have here is really a kind of correlational research. This is our naturalistic observation. It's difficult to identify whether there are other confounds that might explain, why there's so much depression in one group and not so much in another group. Is it perhaps related to the medications that they're taking, that the medications may make them more at risk? Or perhaps it's something about isolation. Throughout the semester, you're going to see a lot of correlational studies. And part of the reason we see so many correlational studies is that they are much, much easier to do. The downside of correlational studies is that it doesn't help. We have difficulty separating out and identifying causation. So one of the things you'll probably hear me and your other faculty talking about frequently is correlation does not mean causation. Now, when we're looking at correlation, we're looking at 2 different things. We're looking at the degree of that the variables are related. Do they both go up at the same time, down at the same time, both of which would be a positive correlation? Or does one increase and the other decrease at the same time? That would be a negative correlation. No correlation is when there's no relatedness. So we're seeing relatedness between a negative correlation of 1, as in the second figure, and positive correlation of 1, as in the first figure, and no correlation in the middle. So we're looking at 2 things. We're looking at the degree of relatedness and how closely they're related. So in the first 2 figures, they're perfectly related. In the third, they're not at all related. I've posted a web page in this folder on correlation, and it'll help you get a better feel for what correlation means. When we're looking at genetics, we're looking at, we have again a naturalistic observation. We're not manipulating any variables. We go out into the population, identify someone who has two parents who have a history of schizophrenia, and we look at their concordance rates and their discordant, the rates of being discordant. 46% if you have two parents with a history of schizophrenia. Not perfect. So, it helps us to identify something about what's going on. Certainly it strikes us as, that genetics is really important here. But also keep in mind that it probably is quite difficult to grow up in a household with two different parents with schizophrenia. And so that is a confound that dirties our research. Unfortunately or fortunately, we can't administer schizophrenia. So it's harder to distinguish. We're going to look at group experiments, longitudinal research, cross-sectional, and quasi-experimental research. So when we're looking at experiments, we're often looking at the effects of an independent variable, in this case morphine, on a dependent variable, in this case ratings of pain. Our hypothesis might be that morphine decrease pain ratings. The difficulty with humans, however, is that humans have a mind, and so we may approach a situation expecting to be better. And so we use placebos in order to counter that expectancy. Placebos look alike. It's difficult to identify whether they're different, and in fact there are designs that make it difficult for even the researcher to know whether the participants are receiving morphine or the placebo. And that means that we then don't know, or the participants don't know whether they're receiving the morphine or the placebo. We're often interested in age kinds of issues. So there are two interesting kinds of designs. Longitudinal, we're looking at the same people across time. So for example, looking at 5-year-olds with a history of abuse. How are they at 15? How are they at 25? And it's then easier to say that that the thing that differentiates them is the abuse, and that the abuse caused the whatever behavioral changes we see at age 25. In the cross-sectional design, we're comparing 5-year-olds, 15, 25-year-olds, but they're not the same 5, 15, and 25-year-olds. And so maybe there are differences in the particular makeup of each group. Maybe there are some cohort effects. So for example, perhaps the 15-year-olds were exposed or were growing up post 9/11. And so that perhaps is what the differences between the 15-year-olds and the 5-year-olds is primarily due to. In single participant designs, it's sort of a quasi-experiment. So we're looking at someone before and after treatment and want to draw some sort of conclusions about, the treatment in this case, decreasing anxiety. That in itself is probably not a great design, because we can see in the following two figures that there are a variety of different things that might explain what happened with Wendy. So in the second design, having more data points allows us to recognize that we just happened to assess on May 1st a time when she had lower levels of anxiety, but that on balance, she was no different across time. On having more data points in the third study allows us to see that the treatment seems to have been effective, so that on average she is doing better after the treatment than before the treatment. So either having more data points allows us to do that, or sometimes we'll do like an A-B design, or without the treatment, with the treatment, without the treatment again, and with it. So, perhaps no drug, Xanax, no drug, Xanax. If we're looking at most research, it tends to focus to a greater degree on whites, on college students, on Christian populations, and it makes that then difficult to generalize to other populations. Do we know that the way that this works in this population will also work in this population? And so one important kind of research, and you'll talk some about this over the course of the semester, is thinking about how psychopathology uniquely manifests in different ethnic groups. The difficulty is that it may be limited by available measures. So we know a lot about the Beck Depression Inventory, which is a commonly used measure of depression. But is that useful in terms, or even if it's translated into Japanese, will it be useful in Japan? Are there different kinds of expectations about what depression is there and how people should be approaching things? So, pros and cons. Let's talk some about the difference between statistical and clinical significance. Most of the research you talk about this semester will we will know something about the statistics used with in that particular case. It helps us to protect against biases in evaluating our data, and helps us to determine whether the results were just due to chance or were they large enough to be statistically significant. We're also interested in knowing whether they are large enough to be clinically meaningful. So if we have just a 1% difference between our morphine and placebo group, is it really useful? It may be statistically significant, but not meaningful. So something just to keep in the back of your head. So what should you do now? What you should do now is begin talking with your group, choose a hypothesis, and then think about ways to study this with your group. Try and approach it from a variety of different ways, and have fun.